Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast for what is our first race recap of the year. Joining me to discuss all the action from Bahrain is the Independent's F1 correspondent Kieran Jackson and FormulaNerds editor Samuel Coop. So let's get into it. So joining me now, as promised, is Kieran and Sam. First of all, chaps, thanks for joining me. Kieran, if I come to you briefly, what did you make of that race, just as an overall kind of view of F1?
I can't help but feel it was a bit underwhelming, to be honest, Sam. I think we had a bit of a build-up. We had a bit of uncertainty before testing. What would Red Bull's new car do? Would it take them further away from the midfield pack, or would it take them closer? And we've quite clearly seen it's taken them further away. I mean, as soon as Max got out of turn 2 ahead, it was done, wasn't it, in terms of a contest at the top? I mean, the only thing that I would say is that between third and kind of 6th, 7th, there was a relatively good battle around the middle of the race. I mean, we didn't know that Sainz was going to be on the podium, so that was quite impressive. But for the last 15 laps or so, there was, little or if not no overtaking, which is pretty disappointing. But I mean, it's kind of gone the way we thought it would. Red Bull dominance, and then kind of seeing who's the best out of the rest of them. So yeah, I'd say I'd give it maybe a 4 or 5 out of 10. I say that.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a thriller. We'll move on to McLaren. We'll talk a little bit about the race, about the rest of the paddock later on. If I sort of just give you the run through, so we'll start with Lando. Started 7th, finished 6th. Did a two stop strategy, which I'm pretty sure the whole grid really did. So Lando came in lap 13, softs to hard, and lap 33, hards to hards. Piastri, a very similar story. Started 8th, finished 8th. Pitted a lap earlier than Norris to begin with, and then a lap later. So yeah, both of the McLaren drivers on very, very similar strategies. And I think, given what Bahrain's like as a track, I mean, it was always likely that McLaren in particular were going to be a two-stopper. Sam, if I sort of asked you about McLaren in general, because I don't know about you, but I think going into this race, and it was probably a lot of what McLaren themselves were saying. There was a lot of pessimism going in. They sort of hinted they probably wouldn't be one of the quicker cars. I mean, they obviously ended 2023 very well. They're probably the best team behind Red Bull. But they seemed to hint that it wasn't going to be that way, at least starting the year. But I don't know about you, but I was surprised by how well they did. I mean, they looked very pacey. Obviously, the Ferraris and the Red Bulls looked a step ahead still. But in terms of the Mercedes, they definitely look right up there in terms of those competitors.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in the past Bahrain not be a McLaren circuit, and we know that it still isn't. So realistically, I think, if you watched the qualifying in the race hoping to see McLaren right at the sharp end, you would have been disappointed. But I think where they actually did finish, and a solid 12 points is a good result, and things are only going to kind of look up from where they are now. As for the off season, yes, they tempered expectations, but Andrea Seller's been quite clear that they're still not quite seeing the diminishing returns to this concept that they are anticipating will happen at some point, and we're seeing across the grid. So there's ample room to grow. So yeah, if there's one team that knows how to turn it around mid-season, it's McLaren. So there's room to be optimistic yet.
Yeah, you're right. I think it is good to point out that Bahrain is it's quite a twisty circuit. Yes, it's got some long straights and some high speed, but it's not really a McLaren circuit. I mean, McLaren last year were very good at these medium to high speed corners, and Bahrain doesn't have a load of them. I think Norris in particular comments on that after the race. Kieran, where would you sort of put? I mean, I know it's hard. We've had one race. It's always quite a harsh question. Where are you putting McLaren sort of in the pecking order of the top teams?
I think maybe third. I'd say in between Ferrari and Mercedes. I mean, just marginally quicker than Mercedes. I know they finished below George, I think, and then well, it was very close, wasn't it? I think what I found interesting about McLaren over the weekend was Lando saying he was a few mistakes away from being P2 in qualifying. I think he said up post quali that if he hadn't made a slight little error in turns 2, maybe another turn, that he had the potential to be P2, which I think shows quite a lot of promise, as you said, Sam, on a track where they're really not strong, and they've had some absolute shockers the last few years at Bahrain. So, I mean, anything better than that to start the season. I think Jeddah will be the real kind of litmus test to see where McLaren are for this early season stage. I mean, like you said, last year really showed the potential medium to high speed corners. Jeddah is full of them. So it'll be interesting to see how they go there. But I kind of, it's so difficult with Lando because when he's so self critical about himself with these mistakes and in qualifying, you almost feel it's always a nagging sense of what could have been. So hopefully that's not a running theme throughout the season.
Yeah, you're right to pick that up on Lando. That is definitely one of his traits. I mean, it got spoken about a lot last year. He's incredibly self-critical. I mean, compared to a lot of the other drivers, I think only probably Verstappen's where he sort of blames, maybe not himself, blames other people just as much as Lando does. But Lando in particular is really harsh on himself. And like you said, like he thought second was there, and I think a lot of the other drivers, if you heard from Leclerc and Russell, they sort of thought there was more out there. And I think even Max, even if he got pole, he thought there was more out there. If we go into their race in particular, like we'll start with Lando. Like obviously a very good race. I mean, he was sort of on his own for a while. He was sort of in between, like you said, didn't have the speed to catch up with Russell and the guys ahead, but he was comfortably holding off Hamilton. Sam, what did you make of Lando in particular? Was it for me? It was a very strong race from the guy.
Yeah, it was an assured drive. It was a mature drive. You feel like he maximised the result. He did what he could, and if anything, the fact that it was so quiet is a positive because it meant that there wasn't unnecessary drama. The result wasn't put into doubt. It was just this is what we can do, and I'm going to do it.
Yeah, you're very true. Yeah, that's very, very right. And obviously he made the overtake. I think he moved past Alonso, and we spoke about how badly the McLaren have been at Bahrain. Like, obviously, we all remember last year where they had probably one of the worst races in their history. I mean, Norris had no end of problems. Piastri had also issues, but even before that, I just saw before we start recording that it's been 2 years since they recorded any kind of points in the opening race. So you're right; it is a much better start for where they've been in previous seasons. If we move on to Piastri, I mean, obviously started 8th, finished 8th, but that doesn't really tell the whole story of his race. He was sort of a guy who didn't manage to keep Hamilton behind, but I don't know if you guys noticed this, and it's something that I picked up on. In his rookie season, he was one of his flaws. I mean, flaws is quite harsh because it was his first season F1. He didn't seem that great at saving tyres, and I think that's probably understandable for a rookie coming in. But in this race, he seemed much better. Like I mentioned earlier about the pitting, and he actually came in a lap earlier than Norris and pitted a lap later in the second run. So, Kieran, what did you make of him as Piastri as a sort of an overall drive? And did you think it was a bit more of like an assured drive from a driver into his second season?
Yeah, I think that's the way I describe it, Sam, for sure. I think starting P8, finishing P8, very solid pit stops, managing his tyres. He's just trying to settle back into a natural flow of being a Formula One driver, right? I think last year was a huge learning curve. We saw his potential by the end of it. But I think he said himself, he said it was a good race, pace seemed okay. I mean, just like kind of like a very 6 out of 10 all over, really, which isn't anything to be sniffed at given he's still learning. He's not as experienced as those around him, or by far the most inexperienced of those around him, actually. So, if he just stays in the mix around there, like particularly on a circuit which doesn't suit him, no problem with that. I think like Oscar, and like I saw Lando and Oscar speaking to Sky afterwards, they seemed pretty satisfied with how they went. Particularly Oscar was like, yeah, I don't feel like anyone's too far away. I don't think like Verstappen Max is actually that far ahead compared to maybe like middle of last year. So yeah, I mean, very, very, very satisfactory, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, if we move on to sort of Saudi, obviously a double header, we're going straight into another race. Sam, do you think we're going to see more from McLaren? Because we've briefly mentioned the Saudi track, even though it's a street circuit, there's a lot of high speed. I mean, it's been well known for being one of the quickest circuits. And you'd sort of suggest, going off what we saw last year, that the McLaren car would be more suited. Would you agree with that sort of assessment?
Yeah, I would. We've seen a McLaren car that likes high speed circuits, and this will be that first test. And I think it's good that it's coming early for them because I think it will be a fair benchmark as to what they can do in the right conditions. Obviously, we know they've got upgrades to come, so I think around Miami, that first kind of big upgrade is expected. But this will be the best kind of benchmark as to how their winter has been, because I think Bahrain isn't necessarily a representative sample for them as a team.
Mm-hmm. And if we sort of move on to the rest of the paddock, we've spoken about Verstappen. We don't really need to touch on him again. He's obviously still quite good at Formula One. Is sort of the assessment after the first race. But if we look at the other teams, that I think McLaren would probably targeting a bit more. And I sort of want to talk about Ferrari just a little bit and sort of what that could mean for McLaren, because Ferrari no doubt looked quicker. I mean, Leclerc obviously had a lot of problems, but I just wanted to talk about that perhaps hint of teammate tension that we saw. I mean, obviously we all know that Sainz is leaving at the end of the year. He's been unceremoniously dumped for Hamilton in probably quite a harsh way, given what he's done for a Ferrari over the years. But I think, I don't know about you two, but you sort of saw a different side to Sainz in this race, that he was willing to not ignore team orders, but not wait for permission. I mean, you saw him overtake Leclerc twice. The first overtake being quite a risky one, not one we tend to see for teammates at least. Kieran, do you think that sort of tension could maybe help McLaren in the long run? And do you think that is something that we're going to see at Ferrari this year?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, Sainz seemed like a man almost liberated by it all, because he's got a year at one of the greatest racing teams in the world, but like with a freedom to know that he can largely go about it his own way, because he's got no loyalties there anymore. Like you said, it was a pretty harsh dumping. We all know why it's happened, because Hamilton's going next year, so you can understand it. But nonetheless, like, Sainz was a race winner last year. And in his previous 2 race wins, he's won them by going about his own strategy. Like when he won at Silverstone in 2022, he did it by like almost ignoring the instructions from the pit wall. Last year in Singapore, he was well aware of what Norris was doing behind him, trying to help Norris give him the DRS. So like, Sainz has this thing where like he's such an intelligent racer as well as a quick racer. He can go about it his own way. So you saw that yesterday for sure. Like, that pass on Leclerc, like, I mean, I'm sure mouths were open at Ferrari pit wall, a bit nervous, but yeah, I think there's definitely potential for that tension to brew this year. And you know, in a race like yesterday where there were no retirements, I don't think the idea that there could be some clashes on track between teammates within that pack at the front could only help McLaren for sure. I mean, you see, I think that definitely can boil over this year. That's definitely a narrative I saw yesterday. The idea that Leclerc thinks he's the number one driver, but Sainz will do everything to prove that he's not this year. And Sainz showed he was quicker yesterday, so we'll see.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, I think obviously we got to take into account that Leclerc had a lot of issues. I mean, he said after the race that in the first 10 laps, his brake balance issues were getting worse and worse every lap, so that's why he kept going off the track. Sam, in terms of the Ferrari car, obviously in this race in isolation, they looked the second best team. They were closest to Red Bull. Do you think, I mean, where would you put them? Like, do you think they're closer to Red Bull than they are to McLaren, or do you think they're still within that sort of second group of teams?
Well, that's a tough one. I think there's still a delta between Red Bull and the rest. So I'd say they're still in that second group. They're within the grasp of McLaren and maybe slightly less so Mercedes. But they have undoubtedly taken a step forward, particularly when it comes to race management and tyre wear. Yes, Leclerc had his issues with brake balance, but Sainz looked far more comfortable and very racy. I think rightly won driver of the day in that sense. And yeah, I think it's a sign of things to come. I think it'll be interesting to see how the dynamic plays out, because I think it can work in both McLaren's and Sainz's favour. This is a guy who, he's got a year-long audition for his next drive in F1. And he is going to go about it his own way. It's in his hands, and it's given him this kind of new lease of life almost, as Kieran kind of said. So, yeah, I think they definitely are the second best team on paper at this point. But as we know, as we saw throughout last season, that will change, that will ebb and flow race to race.
Yeah, you're right to point that out. If we sort of talk about a team that's sort of also been mentioned in that top bracket, obviously that being Mercedes, sort of a split day for them really, because obviously Russell did very well in qualifying to get P3. Yes, he slipped further down, but Hamilton had sort of a different story where he just didn't really seem to find that pace. He had a bit of a slow, I was going to say Saturday, bit of a slow Friday, and then that sort of affected his race on Saturday. Would you say Mercedes are one of those teams that are still I mean, obviously they're still in it, but are you still putting them on the same level as the Mercedes, the McLarens, the Ferraris, Kieran, or do you think Mercedes look a little bit maybe of a step behind as after the first race?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps a bit step behind. I thought Lewis looks like really borderline apathetic at the end of the race. Like, obviously, we know he's not. We know how much racing means to him, and we know how much Mercedes means to him. We know how much doing well in F1 means to him. But he was asked what to take to the next race, and he was almost lost for words. It's like, well, like the reliability of the car, and even that, like Mercedes were managing issues with their engine. So I don't know. I think that's why I put Mercedes a touch behind McLaren, just because I think, particularly in Saudi, I bet McLaren to be better than Mercedes, like given track record and that sort of circuit. Yeah, I mean, Russell drove a solid race, but starting where he was, he'd have wanted to finish on the podium. He didn't. And yeah, like Lewis kind of showed like no kind of means of progressing really beyond the Aston Martin. So it was, yeah, I would put McLaren ahead of Mercedes for that reason. And I mean, Toto afterwards also, like, because Toto's expectations are so high in terms of what he wants to achieve in F1 and where Mercedes should be, that every time they fall short of it, and they're way short of Red Bull now, is just like, wow, it's just not good enough. It's like we have to improve, we have to be better. It's like, well, I mean, you're with the Ferrari McLaren group for a reason, and they might think they're taking a step forward, but as both Russ and Hamilton said, that the race pace wasn't there, which was confusing in their words. So we'll see what happens in the next few races, but Jeddah hasn't really suited them in the past. I remember when Hamilton went out in Q1 a few years ago. So kind of about McLaren to do better there.
Yeah, it was a rare sort of unreliability issue with Mercedes. I mean, I think over the years they've been a team that have been really strong on reliability, and for some reason, something about the cooling was just wrong on both cars. If we sort of move on, I know we mentioned Red Bull briefly as sort of how they're going to be a cut above. I mean, that looks quite clear already. Sam, can I ask you sort of about the overall health of F1? I mean, we mentioned it a bit right at the start. We've had pretty much 2 seasons. Obviously, 2022 was a little bit more competitive at the start, but we've had 2 seasons of Red Bull, and in particular Max dominating. I mean, I think it was Channel 4 did a big bit of Brian Cox about how this is one of the most exciting sports ever. And we mentioned just before we came on air how Sky would sort of saying, tying in with the Oscars next week, that it's one of the most exciting sports ever. And yet that's not what we're really seeing on track, is it? I mean, Verstappen, as we mentioned, sort of just disappeared over the horizon quite quickly, and that was it. Is this going to be, I mean, it's quite an existential question, but is this going to be a problem for F1 in the long run if we have another season of what it was like last year, and potentially another season next year? Because obviously the regulations don't change until 2026.
Ultimately, yes, because as much as, we as media types and, keenly interested parties in Formula One would like to say, oh, well, the battle for second is really close and the midfield's closer than ever. And actually, if you look at the field spread, it's only a second over a qualifying lap. Be that as it may, to the general public and the general audience, that is clutching at straws. If there isn't a race at the front for the race win, it's a less enticing prospect as a sport and as something that you'd use as a form of entertainment. So yes, it is a problem for F1, and it also gives space when there is such dominance from one driver, not even one team, one driver, for other salacious stories to come to the fore, to have more airtime, more kind of whatever they might usually. So yeah, that's also going to be the other side of it, is that we're going to talk about rumor and speculation and all that stuff a lot more because there's not as much to go on from what's happening on track. Even in the Mercedes dominance, at least we had at least Rosberg was running Hamilton close. Perez isn't able to do that, partly because his qualifying pace is setting him back and he's got to work through the field. So that's an issue for F1. We heard rumours last year of F1 wanting Red Bull to put a more competitive driver in that seat. So F1 wading into who a team fields is an overreach, really, let's face it. But yeah, that's where this is all kind of originating from, because it ultimately is becoming, and quickly, more and more of a problem.
Kieran, would you sort of agree with that assessment by Sam?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was just a tough watch yesterday, and I think if you're a standard sports fan, you'd have turned off with like 15 minutes to go, 15 laps to go, and switched over to Soccer Saturday or whatever other sport there might be. Do you know what I mean? You'll have your F1 core fan who will watch every race, and but you want to get the standard sports fan in, and that sort of situation where Saturday prime time, it was a good situation for the first race to happen, and it just wasn't engrossing enough. There wasn't enough going on track, and it's definitely a problem. I think I kind of want to stay optimistic and hope that Checo might be able to push Max at certain tracks this year. He won Jeddah last year. He won Baku. So we'll see maybe if the so-called street circuit king, even though he's not, can maybe do something next week. We saw the Drive to Survive ratings drop as well in the later season, and it just kind of shows that Netflix and Sky and everyone associated with F1 can create these different storylines. Obviously, we've had a huge off-track storyline this week with Christian Horner, but over the course of 24 races, if there's not enough going on track, then it's just not going to be captivating enough for the general viewer. I found it interesting that probably the closest shave we had on track came after the race on the cool-down lap when Tsunoda put the fast on Ricciardo. So it doesn't bode too well over 24 races, but we'll see. It's only been one race. Bahrain is a pretty standard track, which they've been driving for 2 weeks now. So looking forward to having something a bit different.
Yeah, I presume the drivers are as well. Yeah, it's also a shame that we're not an RB podcast because I would love to get a deep dissect of what was going on in Tsunoda's mind. I mean, if you're a team principal, if you're a new team principal as well, like you don't want to have your driver openly defying a team order and then almost crashing into his teammate after the race is over. But yeah, we'll see how that develops. You've both sort of hinted at it. I guess we can talk about it a little bit. The Christian Horner investigation, obviously, a lot's happened every day, and by the time this is probably out, probably more has even happened. But the general state of play, if we catch people up, if they're not aware, I presume they are, but just a little bit of a recap. I'm going to get lost track of the days because they all sort of blur into one during a race weekend. But the Horner announcement came out that he'd been cleared. Red Bull said it's all fine, like we haven't found anything that's worthy of action, kind of thing. And then within 24 hours, and obviously you have to be very careful about this because we don't know the source of it, but I think it was during FP2, an anonymous email sent a load of what they claimed was messages from Horner's. Again, no one has verified that this is from Horner, but obviously that adds more pressure onto Christian and Horner. And sort of, if you heard him speak during this weekend, like he was almost a completely different guy to what we usually see. I mean, anytime you see him near a Sky microphone, he's usually very bombastic. He's usually happy to talk a lot. This time he seemed very, not shy, but very apprehensive, very careful about choosing his words. So if I come to you, sort of this whole situation, I mean, it's sort of enveloping over Red Bull. And as I speak, we've had some even more quotes from Max's dad, Joss, about it all being Horner's fault and he's going to destroy and stuff like that. And it looks like he's still bubbling very much under the surface. Is this enough, do you think, to sort of not topple Red Bull, but maybe make them not as bulletproof as we've seen over the last year?
It's difficult to say because a organisation and a team as well run as Red Bull clearly are should almost have that kind of Hydra-like effect. Like you chop the head off and a new one grows. Taking Horner out of the equation, he's a huge, huge part of their success. No, without doubt, he has been with Red Bull since the start. But they should be able to continue to operate without Horner. So that is one thing. But it's, I guess, whether or not he will say, and there may be pressures from F1, the FIA, from inside Red Bull, saying, okay, this isn't going away. I think if you step aside, that is for the good of not only the team, but the health of the sport as well. I think those pressures will start to grow if this story doesn't start to quieten down. And, as we've seen from the Jos Verstappen comments, even people within Red Bull aren't seemingly wanting to do that. Everyone's got their vested, self-interest. Toto Wolff and Zach Brown kind of saying, well, we need more transparency. Not surprising. They want to destabilize Red Bull. But Jos Verstappen doing that is very, kind of, it plays into that narrative that has started to emerge in the last year or so, that actually the Horner and the Verstappen camps don't completely see eye to eye.
Yeah, I mean, let's move on to Joss's comments. I'm just going to read them out in case no one's heard them. So he said, there is tension here while he remains in position. Obviously, speaking of Horn, he said this to the Daily Mail. The team is in danger of being torn apart. It can't go on the way it is. It will explode. He is playing the victim when he is the one causing the problems. And I think what makes this most consequential, perhaps, is up until now, we've all the Red Bull associated people, so people like Helmut Marko, stuff like that, they've all been very quiet on the front. They haven't really made an outwards comment. They've all been largely not in support of Horner, but definitely not against him. Like, they haven't said they want him out. These comments by Joss, they seem to be on a different level. Like the first time, like you said, Sam, like there's been a lot of suggestions that there's a power struggle going on F1, whereas Joss now has pretty much confirmed that. He said that in writing. He said that Christian Horner's a problem. Kieran, if I come to you, what do you make of Joss's comments? Like, obviously, we know a lot about Jos Verstappen. Like, he's obviously an F1 driver before. He's a very much a constant presence in the paddock due to who his son is. Do you think this is going to be like the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of Red Bull?
Question, like potentially, but because I know Jos and therefore Max hold a hell of a lot of sway of that team, given how good Max is at the moment. I'm just reading those comments myself for the first time this morning as well, and like they're pretty strong, aren't they? And Jos is pretty no nonsense sort of guy, so like he's not being around the bush, and he's not saying stuff which isn't. I mean, that kind of take his word for that. So if he's saying Horner's creating the problems in terms of what's been coming out, which is true to an extent, then yeah, I just don't know how long this story can run without. I don't know where the conclusion comes if Christian really wants to stay in his job. Like I know Red Bull have cleared him in their own investigation, and I know Mohammed Ben Sulayem has said that the FIA aren't yet going to open an investigation. But the longer this story stays in the paddock, the more the FIA and F1 will have to think about getting involved, or at least seeing the documents which are submitted in the report, because you can't have a dark cloud over the sport for so long. It's been, I think these allegations first came out 5th of February, so we're talking near on a month, where it's like all the Hamilton to Ferrari stuff and like all the feedback from that, even though it's still so big, it's kind of been overshadowed by this Horner stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting to see whether it would have an effect on Red Bull, like this continuing or Horner leaving. Like, it's like how and what sort of importance do you place on the team principle? Like, if you're tossing up between what would Red Bull lose between losing Christian Horner or Adrian Newey? You'd say they'd lose way more losing Adrian Newey, right? So it'd be interesting to see what Horner leaving would do to that team and to that company, because he's been at the forefront for like 19 years since their inception. So it would be fascinating to see, but I just think he won't leave. And by the sounds of it, Red Bull aren't quite yet thinking about booting him out either.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Max Verstappen spoke on this point a bit. He was explicitly asked sort of how would the team be affected if Horner left, and I think you're right. The role of team principal isn't like in every like a hands-on kind of thing. Like you mentioned, Adrian Newey's involved in the technical team. If Horner goes, the car's not going to suddenly fall to bits. I mean, it's going to be a longer term sort of impact over the years, and so we'll see how that plays out. Like you said, there's been a big cloud over F1, sort of this, and I believe he had meetings with the F1 president, the FIA president during the race weekend. Sam, if I come to you, do you think this power struggle, I mean, it is pretty obvious there's a power struggle going on. There was a very obvious show of faith. I mean, it was quite farcical at times, like Christian Horner had his wife pretty much everywhere with him, which obviously she's been quite present at races, but not to that degree. They're the Thai owners who own the majority of Red Bull sort of by his side. Do you think we're now starting to see people take sides, and that's just going to be the way it is now?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that has been certainly exacerbated by Jos Verstappen's comments. He's making it binary by what he said this morning, and yeah, I think over time people will start to move into their camps, because it will linger and it will start to cause problems. Yeah, internally with Red Bull, with the sport, and people will just get fed up of it. They'll get bored of it, and when you can't make something go away, and you're getting bored of it, yeah, it's gonna get more divisive. So yeah, that is ultimately where it will head.
Yeah, you're right. That's probably enough Red Bull chat, because after all, this is a McLaren podcast, but obviously these things have impacts on McLaren if anything does happen. last question of the show. Sort of, we sort of mentioned about how good we suspect McLaren to be at Saudi. I'm going to be harsh. I'm going to put you both on the spot and sort of say what will McLaren achieve? I mean, I won't ask for a position because that's probably quite harsh. But let's go with the question: do you think a podium is within reach for one or both of the McLaren drivers? I'll start with Kieran.
Yeah, I think so. I think for one of them, I think getting both of them on there would be tough. You need to look at a Red Bull coming off, obviously. So I think one of them. Yeah, I think for Lando, like if he can just, I would love for it to be seeing here in 5-6 days time after qualifying on Friday, and him saying I'd nailed that lap and I'm therefore P2, P3, like that. And then when it comes to the race, if he gets off to a good start, then the ball is in his court of where he can finish, apart below, assuming Max is below first. So I think a podium is definitely possible. It would be really fascinating to see where McLaren tally up against Ferrari. Will be the big one, because I think they will be quicker than Mercedes, and it's just where we know Charles Leclerc is probably the quickest man over one lap. So can Norris beat Leclerc in qualifying and therefore see where he can start on the grid? So yeah, I'm optimistic for McLaren in Saudi, I have to say. Maybe unwisely so, given their notoriously bad starts to the season. But yesterday wasn't bad, so we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sam, similar story for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, particularly the Leclerc point, I think is interesting. Lando was 2 tenths off him in qualifying. And that was, as we know, Lando came out and said, that wasn't a good lap for me. So if he was close in Bahrain, there's absolutely no reason why he won't be in the mix with the likes of Leclerc and the Ferraris come Saudi. Likewise, Oscar Piastri was within a tenth of that as well. So I think they'll be fighting with the Ferraris, and therefore, by extension, a podium is within reach for one of them. Kieran's absolutely right. 2 is going to be tough, but yeah, they'll be in that kind of 3rd to 5th fight, in my view.
Perfect. Well, that wraps up our first race recap of the year. My thanks again go to both of you, and I'll put all your social links in the description and stuff like that. But yeah, thanks to you, both of you, for joining. My thanks again go to Kieran and Sam for joining me today, and my thanks also go to you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and also follow us on all social media at Pondering Papaya. We'll be back on Thursday for a preview of the Saudi race, so we'll see you again then.